Sports watches are largely the same, bar very few examples. Equateras, Black Bays, and Carreras are everywhere because they're popular, but they kind of all look the same. Dress watches, on the other hand, are cool, but a majority of people avoid them because they lack everyday versatility. Well, I found a watch that does something rare. It's a dress watch and a sports watch in one. Is that a good thing? Let's find out as we take a look at the Fears Brunswick. What we've got here is a 38 or 40 millimeter cushion case watch, which has been both brushed and polished. The model I had was the copper dial with a brushed main dial and a matted sub-seconds dial. The numerals and hands are black and the hands are skeletonized. There is a Fears logo at the 12 o'clock position. The bracelet is a 5-link bracelet, similar in style, but not identical to something you see on a IWC Pilot Mark 20. The crown has an onion-style crown, and it controls a Le Jeu Pareil movement with no date, 68 hours of power reserve, and a small seconds. The price is £3,750. I'll put the dollar indication somewhere here on the screen. You can also get it for just under £3,000 if you sacrifice the steel bracelet and get it on a leather strap instead. My own opinion is it wears well based on the videos on the screen. Yeah, and just so you know, I've got your terrific sized wrists. This watch wears well. It's got heft, but it's not heavy. You know it's there, but never in a bad way. The watch itself feels incredibly solid. There's no flimsiness to the bracelet. After you've handled a lot of watches, you get a feel for how solidly the links are put together. There's often a slightly tinny sound to cheaper bracelets, plus a little bit more lateral play. That's not the case here. Like so many brands in this space, the manufacturing quality is just at a so much higher level than we were used to from this price point 10 or 15 years ago. I do wish it had a regular clasp instead of a butterfly deployment. I know it's for aesthetic reasons, but it would allow for a more functional, easy adjust mechanism. In my opinion, when butterfly clasps do have easy adjust mechanisms, they are typically compromises and they don't give a lot of adjustment and ruin the continuity of the bracelet. I've yet to see one that feels good, but the bracelet on this watch overall feels solid. It drapes as I expect it to, and it balances the watch really well. The case finishing is of a very high standard with both brushing and polishing. This is, super well put together. And for this style of watch, you get something that comes across as premium or, dare I say it, luxury or whatever you want to call it. It's not rugged or durable or minimalist. This watch comes across as expensive looking. That's harder to do than you think. It's often easy to overdo it with diamonds or too many bevels or too many chamfers or far too much polish, but Fears get it right with enough detail to elevate the watch without going overboard. Other things of note, it's not Swiss made. I've got a super relaxed position on Swiss made as a concept. By now, we all know that this is a definition with an incredible amount of leeway. It's not something that requires 100% to be built in Switzerland. But still, that little Swiss-made logo sends a signal branding-wise that some or other watch is good. Christopher Ward have gone all the way and decided that Swiss-made is part of their value proposition. I just like the fact that Fears haven't. Fears is just England, and I like that. It comes across as authentic and with a sort of integrity that sometimes is lacking in that Swiss-made appropriation. So, England it is. Inside, there's not an ETA or a Sellita movement. For a change, this is not a case of yet another brand getting a hold of your bog standard Sellita SW 220 or 510 or 330. It's a Le Jeu Pareil. Le Jeu Pareil and this movement in particular are not stellar movements. The base movement is related to a Miyota movement, but in this configuration, you get 68 hours of power reserve, 24 joules, which is pretty decent. The accuracy isn't stated. Maybe it is on the website somewhere, but you're likely not getting COSC accuracy. Based on the data I could get from Caliber Corner, it's likely the mid-grade model of the Le Jeu Pareil, and that will likely give you plus minus 7 seconds of accuracy. That's in the ballpark of what you often get from Seiko 6R and 6L movements. In fairness, they don't guarantee that range, but often they tend to operate somewhere around there. Seiko accuracy is a bit of a crapshoot, but often they're around that area in real-world tests. Would I get this watch with a display case back? No, I wouldn't, but there are just so many Sellitas out there, so it's just a welcome change that there's something different inside. A small detail that I like about this movement, though, is that it's a bit smoother and quieter than how I experience a lot of entry-grade Sellitas. Whether that's a function of the case acoustics or it's the movement itself, I don't know, but smooth, quiet movements feel premium. So I like this watch. That's no secret, but that's not enough of a reason for me to talk about it. Doing a product showcase is infinitely boring to me. but I think this watch has some elements that make it worth diving into. Specifically, this watch inhabits a fairly unique space in the watch world when you think about it. I'll start with sports watches because on the one hand, the Brunswick is a sports watch. Sports watches essentially follow the same design conventions. Just like dive watches, there's a formula for that generic sports watch. The space is inhabited by the Equiterra, the Datejust, the Longines Conquest, the Tag Heuer Carrera, the Nomos Club Sport, and even the Fiers Redcliffe. They're all different, of course, but they do all more or less follow the same design conventions. You've got a premium bracelet with alternating brushed and polished links. The polish is there to make the watch look a little bit more premium, a little bit more luxury. There's some level of case polishing for the very same reason. The dial is likely going to have a sunray because sunray looks good, and more importantly, it looks expensive compared to a more flat dial. Markers are going to be simple and refined because this is a watch that's meant to fit in, to be versatile, not to stand out too much. Here and there is going to be some flourish that's unique to the brand. So Nomos goes for long lugs. Omega has their signature twisted lugs and teak deck dials. Rolex offers a fluted bezel, and Tudor offers a premium 5-link Jubilee style bracelet. Longines do a railroad track type thing on the Conquest. Overall, though, they are all kind of variations of theme, but the core design conventions are followed. This Brunswick conforms to the majority of those sports watch conventions as well. You've got your steel bracelet with alternated brushed and polished links. You have a polished case. You have a simple but premium dial. All that is just like a Longines or a Nomos or an Omega, but only to a point, because in a lot of ways it challenges those standard conventions. It's got the 5-link bracelet, but there's no sunray dial. It's got a polished case, but it's a cushion case, which is anything but conventional. It's got a simple numeral layout, but it's got an onion crown. You have to admit, it's not quite like those other sports watches. On the other side of the scale, you've got modern dress watches, and the Brunswick conforms to a lot of dress watch conventions as well. Think of the Remadois Milsim or the Baltic with their option that I forget the name of. Jaeger-LeCoultre have the Master Ultra Thin watches, and Nomos have the Ahoys and the Orions. Also there you have design conventions. Usually we're sticking with that simple dial, but for the most part you won't see sunray. More often than not you're going to get a lacquered or a more matted dial. Dial layouts are going to be simple, but usually more complex than sports watches. It's not unlikely that you're going to see complications. It's not unlikely that you're going to see sector dials like the Milsim. It's more common to see a small seconds dial or a pointer date. Salmon and copper dials are not going to be common, but they're far more common here than they are in the sports watch space. Sports watches are black, green, and blue, and once in a blue moon, they're going to be red when they're feeling really crazy, but it's black, green, and blue most of the time. The dress watches are also going to be on the smaller size. Cases in dress watches, I feel, are typically more toned down with the dial taking more of the center stage. For sports watches, it's more of a balanced thing with details like the Datejust fluting or the Equiterra lugs calling for, their share of the attention. The Brunswick fits in the dress watch space as well. It's got the dress watch type dial. It's got copper salmon or meteorite or a pristine white dial. It's got a distinctive crown, and it's available on a leather strap. But as with the sports watch space, there are elements to the design that set it apart from most dress watches. It's the bracelet, it's the pronounced polish, it's the size, it's the case shape that make it not quite like other dress watches. What you've got is a watch that bridges the modern interpretation of that classic dress watch on the one hand, and then the other, an edgier interpretation of the sports watch. In the good old Venn diagram, the Brunswick is here. And this is where I ask, how many watches can you think of that bridge this space? It's not integrated sports watches like a Baumann Mercier Riviera or a IWC Ingenieur. None of those watches would ever get mistaken for being dress watches. Most of the time you can't get them on anything other than steel or rubber bracelets. None of them are dressy. They lean far more into a sporty territory. I really racked my brain, and this is a rare space, and it's inhabited by really few watches. The Cartier Santos, that's in the space. The Fiers Brunswick is in the space, but not a whole lot else, and that's why it's an interesting proposition. Just like the Santos, the Brunswick as a sports watch is the road less traveled. It's got a lot of those design cues of sports watches, but it's different enough to stand out more clearly. By the very nature of the design decisions, it stands more out and conveys a lot more personality and character than those club sports and Equiterras. It might be less appealing to most people, but for a smaller group, those design choices are what they gravitate towards. I also like the appeal of dress watches, but I rarely ever wear dress watches. The environments I work in just don't motivate me that often to go dressy, even though I can appreciate dress watches. But sometimes I do want to wear something dressy. Now, if you take a modern Datejust and throw on a leather strap, it still looks good, but there's something about it where you know that it's not a dress watch. It's a sports watch on a leather strap. The same goes for an Aquaterra. You can do it, but very few people will categorize it as a dress watch. The same goes for the Nomus Club. But watches like the Santos and the Brunswick can transition much better. You can make a Santos look like a dress watch, and you can too with a Brunswick to a large extent. They have enough of those dress watch design cues that look dressy. And I have to be clear, I'm not stating that these two watches are equals. Whether you think that Cartier make better watches or have more cachet than Fiers is not relevant or any way central to my argument. My point is just that they share a common space in terms of positioning. These watches are a rare breed that offer something much more distinctive than your regular fair sports watches, and have also built in a versatility that can transition them from dress to sports and back again with relative ease. And that's the value proposition to me, and something I think some brands should explore more. We all know that dress style watches are nowhere near as popular as they once were. The classic dress watch is not hugely popular. Watches in the dressier space that currently do well are almost all what I'd call novelty items. Studio Underdog has their playful dress watches. Nomos have their colorful clubs that clearly sell more than their Orions. Even brands like Patek have taken their stuffy and staid classic Calatravas and introduced color and different materials to make their dressier options more appealing to a new and younger audience. But they're still among the least popular Pateks, and like some people will likely point out, they are more often than not perceived as holding pattern watches until you get enough of a purchase history to be allowed to buy an Aquanaut or an Nautilus. Making them youthful and colorful is cool, but they're still just dress watches. They haven't moved to the middle space of the Ven. Then you've got brands like Jaeger-LeCoultre and IWC that try to turn their dress watches into sports watches. Notably, JLC throw on a sports bracelet onto the Master Control, and IWC has thrown on a steel bracelet from the Ingenieur onto the Portugieser. But in my opinion, they don't work very well. The Portugieser, to me, with the addition of a steel bracelet, feels out of place because all the design elements of the watch, apart from the classic large size, echo dress watch. And on a steel bracelet, it still just looks like a dress watch on a steel bracelet. So it's not just a question of slapping on a steel bracelet. It's harder than that. But if more brands could do that, I think there'd be a market. If you're new to my channel, the thing I want you to understand is a couple of things. I don't talk about watches to tell you what you should or shouldn't buy. I couldn't care less what you buy. The only personal opinions that matters is your own. I also believe you're smart enough to Google the specifications and don't need me to regurgitate the press release of the manufacturers to you. Whether it wears well on my wrist, I suppose, is interesting if we have similar wrist sizes. But at the end of the day, the way I experience the watch and the way you experience the watch are going to be different. Only you are going to know. The reason I talk about watches and watches like this one is because they're a starting point for an interesting conversation. I chose this watch because design-wise, it's a road less traveled. There are not a lot of watches out there that succeed at bridging this sporty, dressy vibe in one. Exploring and understanding why is the fun part. Nerding out about whether this could be a path for other brands is fascinating to me. And by sharing my thoughts, I get to bounce my ideas off of you. Some points you'll agree on, some points you'll be thinking I'm overthinking, and that's fine. But the conversation, that's the fun part. Anyways, that's it. By the time this video is up, the watch will be back in the hands of Fiers. Now I just need to get my hold of the Jump Hour model they released. We'll get to that in another video. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you have any experiences with Fiers or other brands. What other watches do you feel fit in this dress sports space? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.